So our talk, Natasha and I, is going to deal with the supply chain and the materials risk assessment, and how you can use the ERA software to mitigate those risks, and basically keep track of all of everything that you do related to that. So we're going to look at the importance of the supply chain in sustainability at a risk assessment, both risks from your suppliers and risks from your materials, and then finally look at the risk mitigation tools available in the ERA software. So when doing a sustainability assessment of your company, of yourself, it's important to also review your supplier and your supply chain. It's a vital step in your self-assessment because they're a vital step in your your company. Your supply chain provides you with your goods and services to continue your own business, and from there you want to evaluate what's their economic impact, environmental impact, and social impact on your day-to-day activities. And then from that, from this impact assessment, you'll be able to evaluate the risks and then be in a better position to address them and find any contingency plans if required, or mitigate those risks. So let's start then with the economic risk assessment. Your suppliers provide you the goods and services that are instrumental to the continued existence of your business and to your general business plan. So you'll go from either they'll go from your raw materials and then provide them to you, or there may be several steps intervening there. But really, what you need to do when assessing the economic impact of your suppliers on yourself and your company is evaluate what some of the risks that exist there that are there. Sorry. So you want to know what would happen if anything happens to your supplier. What would happen if something should happen to the raw material source, if this raw material source shrinks, or if costs go up. A very good example of that in very recent history would be Hurricane Harvey, and how several refineries in Texas had to close to make sure that they would limit the damages to their structure from the hurricane rolling in. That led to an immediate increase in the cost of oil and in the cost of oil-related materials, and in the spirit of an economic risk assessment, you'd want to estimate what your options would be in that case. Would you be able to absorb those costs? Would you have to? What would be your contingency plan? You also have to evaluate what would happen if your supply chain ceases to exist. Either they go out of business, or for whatever reason they can't supply you the materials that you required. Do you have a contingency plan? Do you have something if it's temporary, or maybe even something if it's permanent? You might have to look at alternate suppliers and make sure that that you keep your goods and services coming in that situation. Now, alongside the economic risk assessment, we also have to look at the environmental risk assessment. So as Aaron and David just pointed out, we looked at emissions, we looked at briefly scope 1, 2, and 3. When evaluating your supply chain, you want to make sure to evaluate their emissions, their greenhouse gas emissions, and how your activity relates to those emissions. So a good example again here is your utility provider. Any emissions that go into your utility provider's activities to provide you that energy or to provide you those utilities should be considered as your own emissions. And the same is true with any materials that you purchase from your suppliers. Any materials going into their fabrication and construction and manufacture are emissions that could be attributed to yourself. Now, with the emissions, you also want to take a look at your supplier's use of materials. How many of those are reused? How many of those are reclaimed? How many are new? You want to have a good sense of whether or not they're sustainable from the material reuse perspective. And then you also want to look at their energy usage, their water usage, their waste management, and their environmental compliance. So basically everything that we looked at before, you need to do as well for your suppliers. And then finally, what you want to look at is their social impact. You want to see how how these companies impact their environment, how they impact their local communities, whether they're in a socially stable or unstable environment. Anything like that that could threaten the long-term continued existence of your supply chain. So some of the aspects that you will be looking at when assessing the social impact are labor practices, health and safety practices, such as whether or not their safety data sheets are up to date. For example, if they provide you with JHS compliant safety data sheets, or if there are gaps and inconsistencies in the way that all that hazard is communicated to you. Human rights record, so that involves slavery, child labor, indigenous rights, non-discrimination policies, diversity, and equal opportunity policies. All of that goes into the human rights aspect of it, and customer care. You don't really want to be dealing with a supplier in a supply chain that really mistreats their customers. That wouldn't be very beneficial to yourself. So one example that we have in the software where we track something like this pretty well is in the it involves both labor practices, human rights, and general volatility, and that would be the SEC conflict mineral rule. So with the software, you can track which products within your database fall under these conflict mineral rules. So anything that is tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold from the countries that you see up there. So that's the DRC and surrounding countries. Those are considered to be conflict minerals. So that means these are minerals that could have been involved in a conflict and that you need to source properly. If you have any of these minerals within your organization, you need to be able to show where they've come from, and if they come from these conflict mineral zones, you have to be very clear and very explicit on how you know that these are not specifically conflict minerals. So what we have in the software as well to help track this information once you've done all of these assessments are the GRI questionnaires within the sustainability platform. So as you do the screening, as you've completed and you answer all of these questions and you perform everything that I've just described, you can then report what percentage of your suppliers have been assessed, what percentage have either a positive or negative impact on the environment, on the socially to their communities, and then all of this can be entered in and tracked with through the sustainability platform. Now, another thing to evaluate when screening the supply chain, which is not necessarily explicitly mentioned elsewhere, is their hazard communication. And this is something a bit more near and dear to Natasha and I, being part of the CERTIS module, so being part of safety data sheet authoring and label creation. You want to make sure that your suppliers provide you with information that you can understand within your facility, and that complies with both their rules and your own rules. So once you've performed this screening, once you have the data, then you start adjusting your procurement practices. You want to make sure that that the vendors you select have gone through this rigorous screening, have meet the economic, social, and environmental criteria that you've set out for them. You want to make sure that any agreements and contracts that you structure with your new vendors have clauses to mitigate any impact that they might have that is negative to your company. You also want to go back to your current relationships, review those, and make sure you have ongoing collaboration with your suppliers to reduce negative impacts. And this is one place where ERA can help with its vendor partnership program, which we'll go into a lot more detail later on. You also want to set up mechanisms to address grievances. In this case, again, ERA can help through the compliance module and provide events where we can set up mechanisms to address these grievances and have ways of communicating grievances from customers to suppliers. And then finally, if anything, if you cannot resolve any of these issues, if you find that these suppliers are too much of a liability to your current business practices and your sustainability, then you have to look for alternative suppliers or materials that actually do meet the criteria that you lay out. So at this point, I think I want to invite Natasha. I'm not sure which slide this is. But I will invite Natasha to continue and give the materials risk assessment.
So reviewing material hazards along with product use and possible routes of exposure can help evaluate the nature and the amount of risk that it poses to your employee, and also helps identify measures that need to be in place to ensure safe handling of your material. Now, to be able to assess these risks, a full and complete chemical composition is desirable. And incomplete, inaccurate hazards pose risk. It compromises your own risk assessment. So some suppliers are very concerned with having to show the entire chemical composition on the SDS, because that essentially reveals information of their supply chain and also allows for their own customers to bypass them in the chemical in the supply chain. So acquiring accurate and complete chemical information can be quite a challenge. And some of the examples that you might have come across is basically incomplete chemical composition. So if your supplier deems a particular chemical non-hazardous, then you might not see that on your SDS. Proprietary formulas can be masked, so the chemical ingredient will have a generic name. And chemicals sometimes, when it comes to the percent weight of ranges that you see on your SDS, these might be very wide in nature, which essentially means that you are completely reliant on your supplier's health as well as regulatory information, and leaves you with no in-house process to be able to mitigate or to assess the risk. So substitution of currently used materials with less hazardous material is one of the most effective ways of eliminating or reducing exposure to materials that are toxic or pose other risks. And extreme care must be taken when we are making these selections, especially to ensure that you're not exchanging one hazard with another. For example, using a less hazardous environmental substitute. For example, a less hazardous environmental chemical might be chosen as a substitute, but essentially that might pose serious health risks. So in addition to material risk assessment, some other major considerations need to be looked at when considering the suitability of a potential substitute, and these can include effectiveness, compatibility, existing control measures, and waste disposal. So looking for a less hazardous product or a substitute chemical is not always practical. And so we should, in cases like this, providing adequate training to ensure the safe handling of your chemical is extremely important. The safe handling as well as the storage and the disposal. Some important properties to examine or to consider when conducting a material hazard assessment include the acute and the chronic health hazards. Skin toxicity, for example, you need to evaluate whether the chemical is an irritant, whether it causes sensitization, skin sensitization. Also, it would be important to determine whether the chemical can be absorbed through the skin. Overexposure of the chemical can cause, if it does cause hypersensitive reactions like asthma attacks, for instance, then you need to take into consideration of incorporating control measures to ensure that your employees are safe. And when it comes to carcinogenic and reproductive effects, for instance, when you might have to employ special handling procedures. Fire and flammability is one of the greatest hazards when it comes to a product. So taking into consideration flashpoint, flammability limits, reactivity, for instance, are some of the most important properties that help you determine whether your substitute chemical that you intend to go with is going to essentially be less hazardous than the one that you're going to replace. So what we have over here is an example of the substitution in the chemical industry, where we substitute toluene with methyl acetate. So toluene is a solvent in a variety of industries, which include paint and coating, industrial cleaners, etc. So what I have over here is a GHS label for toluene and a GHS label for methyl acetate. Now, both of these chemicals are irritants and they are flammable, but methyl acetate is a it has non-reproductive toxicity and is also an aspiration hazard. Oh, I apologize, does not have aspiration hazard. Using the product composition, a comparison report, which we have in our ERA system, we can actually compare two chemicals like we see on the screen above me. We're looking at two products. We can look at their VOC, we look at their HAPs, we look at their VHAPs. Now, methyl acetate, for instance, is a VOC-exempt chemical, which essentially means it has a very low MIR value, which essentially means that formulators find it easy to be able to use this chemical and meet VOC limits. And as well as methyl acetate is also not listed as a hazardous air pollutant, which makes this a lot more environmentally friendly chemical, a little less hazardous, for instance. So clear and accurate hazard communication using shipping and workplace labels are vital to mitigate the risk of workplace injury. Situations like this, the one on the left, that's a messy bottle. Those are a couple of messy bottles with really terrible labels. And these are more likely to result in workplace injuries than this clear and clean labeling that we have on the image on the right. So we're going to start looking at a few of ERA's risk mitigation tools. The first one we're looking at is the SDS Viewer. So safety data sheets need to be accessible to any employee so that they can have the information ready and they can work safely with that particular chemical or that raw material. And centralizing all this chemical data on a secure online platform allows the employee to quickly access this information and saves time in the case of emergencies. So the ERA's SDS Viewer and Employee Portal are powerful tools that meet this particular criteria. The SDS Finder app is available in Android and on the ISO platform, and this features a very simple and effective way to have continuous access to your SDS library. It also has the option to view SDSs, download, and to email SDSs. Besides just being able to access your SDSs, it's also very important to be able to print and to have access to printing or generating both the GHS shipping labels and secondary workplace labels quickly and efficiently, and ensuring that at all times that the hazards of your product are communicated in an accurate and complete manner. And the SDS Viewer and Employee Portal both have these facilities. So I'm going to present the role back to Francis, and he will continue with some more risk mitigation tools.
Thank you, Natasha. So quickly to wrap up, we also have other tools that help mitigate these risks, and this is where ERA comes in to help you with following your supplier and material assessment to make sure that that you have the proper tools to be sustainable. So one of those tools is the vendor partnership program. So this is something that we've alluded to multiple times prior to this. This is a way for data to come into your database directly from the supplier with full chemical composition. With the vendor partnership program, you're able to get chemical disclosure at a very high level from your suppliers. Typically, we're talking environmental data sheet level of disclosures, and be able to then use our master chemical list to leverage that the regulatory information and the chemical information from those imports. So if we look strictly at chemical disclosure, the data is based on the chemical formulation rather than the safety data sheets provided by the supplier. The imports will analyze what's currently in the system and determine what needs to be updated and what needs to be revised. And then we then track the revisions of your products within your database. So here we have an example of the user interface when you're bringing in a new product or a new batch. where it tells you the number of new products, the number of updates, so very minor changes, and the number of revisions. So those are the changes that exceed the criteria that we have for an update. Once this information is in your database, you can use that chemical information and leverage the master chemical list for that regulatory information. So you can create reports that track multiple regulations. And one example that we have here at the bottom are these US SEC conflict minerals. So the system can notify you whether or not you have these chemicals within your database, and then you can take the proper steps to determine the source of these minerals. You also are not limited on the regulations that you're using, so you don't have to stick with the ones that your suppliers will have declared either on an environmental data sheet or on a safety data sheet, but you can actually leverage all the information and the research done by our regulatory team to make sure that your chemicals, the regulatory information on your chemicals is drawn in appropriately. And then the final aspect of leveraging the MCL for this batch is that you can identify the chemical hazards. So what we have here is a screenshot of our master chemical list where we can see all of the GHS hazards associated with toluene in this case. So in conclusion, ERA has tools to help you mitigate the risks once you've performed your assessment. So through the sustainability module, we allow you to keep track of all of the results of your assessment of the supply chain, and then with the SDS Viewer, we can manage. We have management tools for your own material SDSs, help with the health and safety of your employees, and we can also help with label generation within your facilities. And our vendor partnership program allows you to make sure that you have very good chemical information, full disclosure of your chemical data, and allows you for the leveraging of the master chemical list regulatory information to then create the necessary reports.